This is Static Whisper Stories. It had never once been wrong, until it flagged her. Before I tell you what Dr. Marcus Elliott found in those files, I need you to understand something about the way patterns work. Your brain was designed to find them. In static, in clouds, in faces carved into tree bark. It's a survival mechanism. Pattern recognition kept your ancestors alive. The rustle that looked like wind, but moved like a predator. The stranger who smiled didn't reach his eyes. But what happens when the pattern you find is you? Marcus Elliott had been a grief counselor for 15 years. Not a therapist in the clinical sense. He didn't prescribe. He didn't diagnose. He sat with people who had lost someone in a clean beige office on the 4th floor of a building in Portland, Oregon, and he helped them carry what couldn't be put down. He was good at his job. Consistently rated among the top practitioners in the Pacific Northwest. A waiting list 18 months long. He charged on a sliding scale. He genuinely, methodically, completely cared. He had entered the field because he had lost someone. That part wasn't unusual. Many grief counselors say the same thing. You fall into a dark place. Someone helps pull you out, and you decide, consciously or not, to become the rope for someone else. It's one of the more quietly beautiful things people do with suffering. Marcus had lost his younger sister, Leah, when he was 24. She was 21. The circumstances were strange, not violent, not scandalous, just deeply and specifically unusual. She had died during what should have been a routine outpatient procedure, caused by an extremely rare adverse reaction to a standard local anesthetic called bupivacaine. The odds were roughly 1 in 300,000. The hospital had never seen it before. Neither had the attending physician. Neither had the anesthesiologist. Marcus had spent 2 years in therapy himself, then a master's program, then a supervised internship, then his own practice. By the time he sat down in January to compile material for an academic paper, a retrospective on grief patterns. Across a 15-year career, he had seen 412 patients, 412 people. He had a secure digital archive, every file anonymized with a 4-digit code. Every session note organized by date, loss type, circumstances. He had been meticulous about documentation from the start, partly out of professional obligation, mostly because data had always steadied him. Numbers felt like solid ground. The paper he was writing was about what he privately called grief signature, the idea that the specific circumstances of a loss shape the emotional texture of the grief in measurable, consistent ways. He had seen it intuitively for years. Now he wanted to quantify it. He started pulling circumstance fields from his archive. Cause of loss, relationship to the deceased, location, age, approximate time of year, presence of trauma markers. He was 4 hours in when he stopped. He stared at the screen. He scrolled back up. Read it again. He had flagged a field for rare or atypical medical event. He'd used it sparingly, only when a loss genuinely had no obvious cause or involved something medically unusual enough to be notable. He'd expected maybe 30 entries. 40 at most. He had 209. That was 50.7% of his total patient base. He sat very still. Grief counselors do see more than their share of traumatic and unusual losses. People in crisis don't seek help for simple deaths. He told himself that. He had perhaps overflagged. The category was loosely defined. That would explain it. He tightened the filter. Only losses where medical records cited a rare adverse reaction, a statistically improbable event, or a documented 1 in 100,000 occurrence. 60-1 patients, 61 people who had lost someone to something impossibly unlikely. He sat back in his chair. That was 14.8% of his patient base. The statistical baseline for that category nationally was roughly 1 to 2%. He needed air. He went to the kitchen, poured water he didn't drink, stood at the window, watching rain drag slow lines down the glass. He breathed the way he taught his patients to breathe, slow in through the nose, longer out through the mouth. When he came back to his desk, he told himself he was going to find a data entry error, a coding mistake, some artifact of how he'd labeled things in the early years when his system wasn't fully standardized. He opened the 61 files one by one. By the 11th file, he had stopped looking for the error. The 61 cases weren't random. He could see that now. The rare medical events that had taken people from his patients' lives weren't diverse. They clustered. They kept circling back to the same mechanisms. Drug interactions so improbable they'd been published in medical case reports. Allergic cascades that doctors called freak occurrences in their notes. Anesthetic responses on a yellow legal pad. He'd switched from the screen because he needed the physical act of writing. He listed every substance or mechanism involved. Bupivacaine appeared 3 times. Same anesthetic that had killed Leah. He set the pen down. He picked it up. He wrote the word. Coincidence. Then underneath it, probability. He wasn't a statistician, but he was methodical. He spent the next 2 hours building the simplest possible calculation. 61 patients over 15 years. 3 of them connected to a loss involving the same rare anesthetic compound. The base rate of bupivacaine-related adverse events was approximately 1 in 300,000 procedures. The math was ugly. He took the legal pad to his couch, lay down with it on his chest, and stared at the ceiling of his dark home office for a long time. He thought about something a statistics professor had told him in graduate school. The most dangerous thing about pattern recognition is that your brain will find a pattern in noise if you're motivated enough to look. You have to ask yourself, what are the odds I would notice this if it pointed at a stranger? Was he motivated? Was he seeing noise? He thought about Leah. He thought about the strange flatness in her voice the last time they spoke, 2 days before the procedure. How she'd said, "I keep thinking something's going to go wrong." How he'd told her she was being anxious. How he'd been right, the way people are right when they say the wrong right thing at the wrong moment. He slept on the couch without meaning to. He dreamed about a red string pulled very taut between 2 points, and he couldn't see either end. He took a week away from active sessions. He converted his dining room table into a workspace. He printed anonymized summary sheets for all 412 cases and organized them into loose groupings. Then he did something he hadn't planned to do. He started mapping the timeline. Every loss that had led a patient to his door, plotted chronologically against his own career. He used index cards and a large sheet of drafting paper his architect, neighbor had given him years ago. The result was a visual he didn't have a name for. A tree, maybe. Or a root system seen from below. What he noticed first was density. The unusual losses weren't evenly distributed across his career. They were clustered around 3 distinct periods. And each cluster followed a gap, a period where his practice had stalled, where referrals had slowed, where he'd briefly considered whether to continue at all. He had never spoken to anyone about those gaps. They hadn't been publicly documented. His waiting list had stayed full, publicly. The stalls had been quiet internal things. A few months each time where he'd felt disconnected from the work. Hollow in a way he couldn't explain to colleagues. And then, a cluster of new patients. Unusual losses. Grateful, deeply bonded clients who referred others. And the practice surged. He stood in front of the dining room table for a long time. He went to his laptop and opened his calendar archives going back 15 years. He documented every personal low point, every professional stall, every period of doubt. Then he laid that timeline against the cluster. Map. They matched. Every single gap in his professional confidence, preceded by 2 to 6 months, a cluster of unusual losses. As if something had been resupplying him with purpose, with patience, with grief that needed to be counseled. His hands were steady. He was proud of his hands being steady. He put on his coat, walked 17 blocks in the rain, came back soaked, stood in his shower with his clothes still on until the water ran cold. When he got out, he went back to the table. He had one more thing to check. He needed to know if any of his patients had ever known each other. He had never cross-referenced patient files for social connection. There was no professional reason to. The confidentiality framework made it something he actively avoided even considering. But anonymized data still contained geographic markers, professional categories, approximate social context. He wasn't looking for names. He was looking for nodes. A node would be a patient who shared a geographic or professional marker with another patient who had also experienced a rare medical loss. If the 61 cases were genuinely random, the distribution should mirror the general demographics of Portland, diffuse. Proportional. What he found was not diffuse. 3 neighborhoods appeared disproportionately often, not in his general patient base, specifically in the unusual loss subset. 3 zip codes, accounting for 41 of his 61 flagged cases. He drew lines between the 3 zip codes on a map, not with red string that felt too dramatic, too self-aware, just with a ruler and a fine black pen. The lines formed a rough triangle. In the center of the triangle was a neighborhood. He knew. He'd driven through it 100 times. It contained an outpatient medical facility. He'd also driven past without ever really registering. He looked up the facility online. General Outpatient Surgical Clinic. Routine procedures. Operating since 1998. He searched the address combined with adverse reaction. He found a local newspaper article from 2007. A patient had died during a minor procedure. Rare anesthetic response. The facility had been cleared of negligence. The event was statistically freakish. Staff had followed every protocol. The anesthetic cited in the report was bupivacaine. He returned to his oldest files, the physical binders in his closet from before he'd built a digital system, and found the intake notes from his very first patients. Patient code 1. Lost type, medical. Rare adverse reaction to local anesthetic during outpatient procedure. Zip code, the center zip code of his triangle. He checked 2. Same zip code. He checked 3. Different zip code. Natural causes. He breathed. He checked 4. Same zip code. A note in the margin. Outpatient center nearby. He sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, not in collapse. He just sat down because the chair felt like the wrong place to be. He sat with his back against the cabinet and looked at the ceiling and said out loud to no one, "What is the shape of this?" He hadn't thought carefully about the details of Leah's procedure in years. Good grief, processed grief, works that way. The loss becomes background. Not gone, just integrated. You stop measuring it every day. Now he opened a drawer he rarely opened in a desk in the spare room that had been hers for 2 summers, and took out the physical folder he'd kept. Not clinical, personal. A printout of the hospital notice. A copy of her death certificate. The medical summary the hospital had given his parents. He read it for the first time in over a decade. The procedure had been at an outpatient clinic. He read the address. His hand stopped. Being steady. The address was in Seattle. He'd grown up in Seattle. He'd moved to Portland specifically because the distance felt healthy. The city felt neutral. No geography carrying the weight of memory. But the facility address in Seattle. The street name. He knew that street. He had been on it. Not in childhood, recently. Within the last 3 years. He looked up the street in his patient files. 4 patients. All unusual losses. 3 with medical flags. He had a small number of remote clients in Seattle. He'd offered video sessions for years. Had done so quietly and without promotion. He'd never cross-referenced Seattle clients against anything because there were simply so few of them. He found the intake notes for the first Seattle client. Patient code 2847. A man in his late 50s who had lost his wife. Rare cardiac event. No prior history. She had been 52. Referral source. A grief support community in Seattle. Marcus had no connection to that community. He had never advertised in Seattle. He had never lectured there. He searched his records for every patient referred from the Seattle community. 11 patients. He searched for the founding date of the community. It had been founded in 2010. 1 year after he had opened his practice. He searched for who had founded it. The founder's name was Daniel Marsh. Marcus didn't recognize it. He searched for Daniel Marsh in his patient files. Patient code 0017. One of his earliest clients. A man who had lost his daughter. The daughter had died during an outpatient. Procedure. In Portland. 3 blocks from Marcus's first office. Here is what Marcus knew. Laid flat and factual. He had entered his field because of a specific rare medical event. He had built his practice in a city he'd chosen partly by chance. Over 15 years, a statistically improbable number of his patients had lost people to the same category of rare event that had taken his sister. Those patients clustered geographically around specific facilities. One of those facilities was on the same street where his own loss had occurred. A former patient had independently built a grief community that had in turn funneled more clients with similar losses back to Marcus. The network was real. He had documented it. What the network meant, he could not say. He thought about what his statistics professor had called the 2 failure modes of pattern recognition. The first, seeing pattern in noise, finding meaning in coincidence, because you're motivated enough to connect dots. The second was rarer and far more dangerous, failing to name a pattern because the implication is unbearable. He did not know which failure mode this was. He sat with that not knowing, the way he had taught 412 patients to sit with the unbearable not knowing of grief, the not knowing of why it happened. Why them? Why then? What it meant about the world, that something like this was even possible. He had always told them, meaning doesn't require cause. Some things happen, and the most important work is not explanation, but endurance. He stared at the drafting paper on his table. It clusters, the lines, the triangle, and at the small notation he'd added at the edge, almost without realizing he'd written it. Was I placed here? Or did I make this? He didn't know. That was the most honest thing in the room. He genuinely, carefully, methodically did not know. He folded the paper, put it in the drawer with Leah's file. He went to bed. At 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. A new message from his scheduling system. A new referral inquiry, forwarded from a grief support community in Denver he had never heard of. The intake form had been pre-filled by the referral source. Loss type, medical. Rare adverse reaction during outpatient. Procedure. He stared at the notification for a long time. Then he opened it, and he began to read. I want to leave you with something Marcus wrote in a private note on his phone. Not for the paper, not for any professional record, just for himself. He wrote, I have spent 15 years helping people survive the knowledge that the world is random and indifferent, that loss has no architect, that grief is not a message, that the unbearable thing happened because unbearable things happen, and there is no reason. And that is the truth you have to learn to hold. I still believe all of that. I just don't know if I believe it about myself. That's the thing about patterns. They don't need to be designed to be real. They don't need a cause to reshape everything you thought you understood. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't discovering that something is out to get you. It's discovering that the shape of your entire life, every choice, every loss, every person you've helped, and every reason you've gotten out of bed for 15 years might be the outline of a question that was never meant for you to answer. Marcus never published the paper. He's still seeing patients. The Denver referral. was the first of 3 that month, all from cities he'd never worked in, all from communities he'd never contacted, all unusual losses. He keeps a second folder now, separate from the clinical files, hidden in the same drawer as Leah's death certificate. He hasn't shown it to anyone. He doesn't know if he ever will.